Hello and welcome back. The theme for today's video is going to be grifting, also known as being paid for one's work. This has been a constant snipe, a constant allegation from the likes of Christopher Snowdon, employed by Spiked magazine and presumably paid. Mr. Snowdon continually harassed John Sweeney with this allegation when John Sweeney was producing his podcast questioning the Letby conviction. And I wanted to start by inviting Mr. Snowdon to think about one simple question, which is, are we the grifters? This whole subject took rather a darker turn earlier this year, because it was discovered by a Twitter user called Northern Lass that, rather astoundingly, the hosts of the Daily Mail podcast The Trial had been paid indirectly by Cheshire Police. The arrangement for this is that Cheshire Police were paying a limited company called Media Factory Limited for services including training and publicity. And one of the payments for publicity was almost exactly around the time that the trial started. Media Factory Limited is directed by Caroline Broster, and it was discovered also by Northern Lass that Caroline Cheetham is married to her colleague Paul Broster, so Caroline Broster is the married name of Caroline Cheetham. And then it also emerged that joint podcast host Liz Hull is employed by Media Factory as one of their trainers. Now, I'm not alleging that these payments were a direct quid pro quo for any particular type of favourable coverage or pro-prosecution coverage. In fact, if you look at my previous episode on the Mail podcast, I have a somewhat complex view of it. Overall, it's not directly or clearly pro-prosecution as such. It gives some coverage to both sides, and particularly in the later episodes when they're covering the defence case, they actually changed the intro, which I hadn't realised before until I listened to it again more recently, to give more pro-defence points in the intro, whereas in the earlier episodes covering the prosecution case, they'd used pro-prosecution quotes in the intro. I'd commented in that other video about the weird tone that they read things out in, and they often clearly implied that defence points were unmeritorious. However, despite, I think, having a complex view of it, I do still think it's dodgy and crosses the line in places, particularly that original intro where they kept saying, "Trust me, I'm a nurse," in a sort of dodgy, sarcastic voice, clearly implying guilt.
You said those muggers who attacked you with baseball bats didn't know who you were.
Oh, chinny reckon.
This could arise simply out of the conflict of interest itself. The fact that Caroline Cheetham had been working with Cheshire Police before doing the podcast could in itself create an unconscious bias in that she might end up producing content that happened to favour the police without deliberately meaning to. But it goes a little bit further than that level of bias, because it says in the Cheshire Police financial records that they'd made payments for publicity. I asked Cheshire Police to explain this, and their response was that no records exist explaining this. So we have no official explanation for these publicity payments. So in the absence of any explanation from them, we are left with the only information being that Cheshire Police made payments to Caroline Cheetham for publicity, and that one of these payments corresponded very closely with the start of her podcast. It might be no more than the fact that Cheshire Police thought an independent and fair podcast covering the trial was a desirable thing and therefore wanted to fund it. But even then, that's an absolutely astounding conflict of interest. And it's simply unbelievable that she would accept that. So if there's a better explanation than that, I invite Cheshire Police to contact me, and I will do a further video giving their explanation. There are two further things that make criticising the Mail podcast quite difficult. One is that they, at the time, were not allowed to give any commentary on the evidence being heard in court, though I think in a few places they did that via tone of voice. The second is that the case itself was just insane, and if you have to repeat insane things people are saying, it's going to make your coverage of it sound insane. But to some extent that's the fault of the prosecution case itself rather than their coverage. And I think in my first video it somewhat became a criticism of the prosecution case as much as it was of the podcast. And it's very difficult to separate the two things out. There's also clearly a risk that she could have been exposed to unreliable information from the police, as the lawyers say, that wasn't tested in court. So they could have given her private assurances that they've got secret information showing guilt that maybe didn't really exist or was completely unreliable. I haven't done another review of a full Mail podcast episode because of the problem with just ending up going into criticisms of the case itself rather than their coverage. But what I'm going to do now is look at a few short extracts from some of their episodes. This is Caroline discussing baby C in episode 5.
Okay, but he recovered actually quickly at that point, didn't he? Without any intervention, and his breathing returned to normal on its own. And I think the jury were told Sophie Ellis went to work on a computer in the same room. It was in nursery 1, opposite baby C's cot.
This seems like a bit of another inappropriate reaction tone of voice, because it's being said that Sophie Ellis is opposite in the same room, which doesn't make the allegation more likely, but seems to make it impossible. This is episode 32, where part of the way through the defence case, the Mail podcast, for some reason, decides to give a lengthy recap of the prosecution case.
And you may remember baby Dee's mother gave evidence to the court in person. She told the jury that when she first went to visit her daughter in nursery 1 at around 7 p.m. on June the 21st, she saw Lucy Letby hovering around her cot in nursery 1, but not doing much.
It's worth pointing out here that Lucy Letby wasn't baby Dee's designated nurse that night, but she was looking after other babies in the same intensive care room.
And baby Dee's mother told the court that when she went to see her daughter, Lucy Letby made her feel uncomfortable.
There is, however, a good bit towards the end of the episode where they do make clear that bathing the baby and making the memory box and so on are routine bereavement care and not something that Letby has invented herself. This is an extract from episode 43 where we're going into the prosecution summarising, and Caroline claims that we're about to hear that Letby had training on the dangers of air embolism just days before the baby A case.
We'll also explain that Lucy Letby had training on the dangers of air embolus days before she allegedly started attacking babies.
But then later in the episode, she says that it was some weeks before. It's not clear whether this is her error or whether the prosecution changed this.
Describe how the timings of some of the alleged attacks were strikingly similar. We'll also reveal how she allegedly used chance opportunities of babies being alone to attack them.
We've also got Liz there repeating the claim that Lucy not only timed her attacks suspiciously carefully, but also based them on chance opportunities, two things which seem completely inconsistent with each other. But from the tone of voice that she's saying it, it sounds like she's lapping it up. And then we've got this very meta interview with a media law expert where they discuss a precedent for the law on media coverage where a newspaper had used a headline "Driller Killer."
They were going to grab the reader's attention by running the headline "Driller Killer Horror" on my report. So that went out that afternoon, and I went back to court, and to my sort of dismay, the defence team are on their feet, waving a copy of my paper at the judge.
About an allegation of somebody killing with a drill, and they were cleared of contempt because although the headline in isolation was prejudicial, the court decided that it was okay because in the smaller text of the article itself, it made clear that this was merely an allegation and not a fact. And the reason I say that's meta is because in that very same episode, the trial podcast opens with that dreadful "trust me, I'm a nurse" thing, almost as if they were using that advice to do that. So having given the Mail podcast the partial benefit of the doubt earlier in that they were restricted in what they could say during the trial, I'm going to wrap up my discussion of them by having a look at episode 54, which is an episode they did just after the verdict, where they no longer have the cover of that restriction. And in this episode, they have a lengthy and, I would say, absolutely revoltingly sycophantic discussion with Paul Hughes, where they incessantly praise his investigation. You might think this would be an excellent opportunity to declare any conflict of interest, for example, but nothing. And we get this absolute further rubbish from Paul Hughes. The first thing that struck me was Hughes tells them that the letter they'd received from the Countess had asked them to essentially rubber stamp the hospital's investigation. And at first I thought this can't possibly be true, but when you look at the notes about that letter on the Thirlwall website, his summary of it actually isn't all that unreasonable, and it's clear there was an internal conflict in the hospital between the management and the doctors, in that the management had done thorough investigations and found no wrongdoing, but the doctors were still making allegations. What I don't understand is how they got from there to what Hughes did next, because when we go to the next part I want to look at, it's actually Liz Hull who, I think, incorrectly suggests to him that none of the hospital's investigations could find any explanations for the incidents. And when we look at the letter again, you can see that most of them, or at least most of the ones that Lucy was charged with, had already been explained. At that point they were saying there were more that weren't explained, but those were ones she wasn't ultimately charged with, which in itself raises a lot of questions. Hughes then repeats this line that he's been told by Ravi Jairam about how what happens with premature babies is they are cared for, they grow up, and they go home.
Where they explained to me, babies in neonatal units, they come in and they grow and they go home. Yeah. And although they are very, very fragile, very delicate babies that need care, there's no expectation of death, there's no expectation of collapse.
This again is the problem with the heart of the case, with the probability and statistical understanding of things, because the unit was dealing with about 400 premature babies a year. So that was what was happening. And then Hughes says, sadly, in a few cases, they do die. And that is what was happening. So he's failed to establish that there's anything at all to investigate there. Although he seems to think this is the absolute clincher that proves something is going on right from the beginning without grasping that. And of course, Caroline and Liz have absolutely no comment or correction to add on this. Hughes claims that the investigation was meticulous because he assigned one detective to each baby, so each case was kept independent.
But it also separates the potential sharing of the information initially so that other people's mindset would be altered by what they've heard in another investigation. So initially it was keep it separate, to keep a sterile corridor of evidence.
I think we already saw from Cheshire Police's own video what one of the investigators' own take on that was, and it was rather different.
Going into the office, and when I first joined and speaking to Paul at length, I knew that there was going to be a case to answer, because otherwise he wouldn't be gathering people in.
Hughes then completely contradicts that by saying that once they arrested Lucy, they asked her to explain what it is, and you tell us what it is, and then we'll go and put that to the expert, and he'll tell us if your explanation of what it is correct, thereby treating it completely as one incident, and then there must be one cause, and it couldn't be that all these babies had completely different problems.
We had one expert's evidence at that point, so we're waiting for her to fill in the gaps. Go on then, Lucy, you're a good nurse, you tell us what it is, and then we can take that back. So,
thereby completely excluding what I think is the actual explanation. I suspect that Lucy told them about the plumbing problem in the hospital because in the Cheshire Police video Hughes let slip about the bad bug in the water, so that's probably where he got that from, I reckon. It's interesting that they've never released any more footage at all of Lucy's interviews except that one very, very small clip. There's this absolutely disgusting interaction where Hughes again repeats this thing about Lucy being cold and unemotional, cooperative, not doing enough to protest her innocence, not arguing, not banging on the table and shouting that she wants to be released.
she was quiet, she wasn't obstructive, but she answered the questions, she dealt with everything.
Controlled.
Control. Yeah.
We had this conversation, didn't we, Liz, about this level of control, composure, calmness. Just as human beings, we were sort of saying, can you imagine, I'd be screaming and shouting. And
Where's the banging on the table saying, well, if you're saying these babies have been killed, I've cared for these babies, go and find the killer.
Partly, sir. It's usually a sign of guilt.
I wonder if, as such experienced crime reporters, Liz and Caroline are aware of the Colin Norris case. Colin Norris has just lost his most recent appeal, so the official verdict remains that he's guilty. One of the things that is notable about his case is that when he was arrested, he banged on the table and shouted that he was innocent, and this is widely taken to be proof of his aggressive personality and tendency to violence. So not only is that a rather questionable inference to draw when someone doesn't do that they're guilty, you also have to wonder if defendants are routinely advised to absolutely not behave like that because it will look bad for them.
Should do something, Optimus Prime? Negative. Any action we take now would be viewed as admission of our guilt.
Hughes also claims that one of Lucy's failings was that she didn't tell them to go out and find the actual killer. This is inconsistent with other commentators who have pointed out that at other times she did do this and thereby apparently accepted that there had been murders. So it looks like she didn't do this during the police investigations because she didn't accept there were murders. If there were murders, she is the only person who could be guilty of them. So Hughes is completely biasing the investigation there. Because if she'd done that, she would then have been accused of accepting that there were murders and therefore must be guilty. And again, this massive problem with the case is completely ignored by Liz and Caroline. Hughes also says that they started their investigation by seeking advice from the National Crime Agency about how to appoint the best possible expert. Now, it's possible that Hughes wasn't present for the relevant part of the trial where this was discussed, and it was demonstrated in court that Dr. Evans had lied about how he'd been appointed. But Liz and Caroline claim they sat through the entire trial, yet they don't correct Hughes's misinformation here. So there we have it, Mr. Snowden. Crime scene to courtroom, bringing in the money. Dr. Oliver, bringing in the money. Spike magazine, bringing in the money. The Daily Mail's trial podcast, bringing in the money. £23,000 just from Cheshire Police. I know John Sweeney did ask for donations. He said that the donations he received didn't even cover the cost of his lawyer, which I absolutely believe. Private Eye, of course, sell their magazine, but there doesn't seem to be any dishonour in that, provided that the coverage they're giving to the case is fair and honest, which it appears to be to me. Is there anybody else making any money from the innocent side? My YouTube channel is not monetised. No other YouTube channels that I'm aware of on the innocent side are monetised. But as we've seen, there is one side that very much is monetised. Thanks once again for listening to my video. Please subscribe. If you've liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't, give it a thumbs down, and I'll see you next time. The guilty side. Sophina says hello. Sophina's a cat, by the way.